Welcome to all those in the room and also those online to this very special DPU Dialogues in Development on advancing gender justice in policy and planning, current and future challenges. This event celebrates not only 70 years of the Development Planning Unit, but also 40 years of working with gender in policy and planning in the DPU. My name is Karen Levy. I'm a Professor of Transformative Urban Planning here at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit in UCL. And I'm also, with my colleague Julian Walker, co-director of DPU's Gender Policy and Planning Program, and I'll be chairing the session. We have a panel of 5 wonderful speakers who I'll introduce in more detail later. For now, I'd like to welcome them all to this panel, to Caroline Moser, Claudie Bouet, Rodora Bokoy, who's going to be recorded online, Leslie Crossdale, and Julian Walker. But before we invite contributions from the panel, I'd like to say a few words about DPU's Gender Policy and Planning Program. This is an international program which encompasses teaching, action research, policy advice, and institutional capacity building. It's a body of work in what is today a sophisticated, wide-ranging, and multidisciplinary field of feminist practice at local, national, and global levels in a range of very different institutional and organizational contexts. In 1984, Caroline Moser, one of our speakers today, initiated the DPU's first gender planning short course. And at that time, I was a young academic who supported that initiative. This beginning is a clue to the focus of the DPU's Gender Policy and Planning Program. It's a program that links theory, methodology, which is the centerpiece of our program, and practice in the pursuit of gender equality and women's rights in international development. Like many initiatives at that time, our work marked a shift from women to gender. Our work also sought to give meaning to the notion of gender mainstreaming, which was, those you probably know, endorsed in 1995 at the 4th World Conference on Women. It was endorsed as, to quote, as a critical and strategic approach for achieving gender equality. At the same time, we have in our program, we've also explored intersectionality in policy and planning in the context of post-colonial challenges. And from our current vantage point today, gender mainstreaming, if we look back, gender mainstreaming has encountered many problems and a wide range of resistances to the transformative change that it was intended to achieve. In the words of a recent statement by the UN Secretary General, achieving gender equality and empowering women and girls is the unfinished business of our time and the greatest human rights challenge in our world. Well, that's appropriate anyway. Recently, gender justice has emerged as a rejuvenating guiding concept to take this challenge forward, and this is something we can explore more in this session together. But in this session, what we want to do is to reflect on this 40-year experience and discuss the current and future challenges of advancing gender justice in policy and planning. And to this end, we have a fantastic and extremely experienced array of speakers who will take us to different scales and focusing on different issues to explore this discussion. I would like to introduce our first speaker, Caroline Moser. And basically, Caroline, we're so pleased to have you as our first speaker. Caroline is an honorary professor at the Bartlett DPU at UCL And as I mentioned earlier, she was our colleague at the DPU between 1978 and 1986 when she initiated DPU's work on gender. Caroline is a social anthropologist, an urban social anthropologist, and a social policy specialist, and her work focuses on three intersecting themes: the interrelationship between gender transformation, asset accumulation, and violence and conflict. In a long and varied career, Caroline, which I'm not going to list at this point, but just to say, Caroline is an emeritus professor at the University of Manchester, where she was the director of the Global Urban Research Centre. And currently, she's a very active independent researcher and advisor. For example, most recently, a committee member of the Chilean Milenio Social Science Initiative Program and many other interesting initiatives. So today, Caroline will address us on the challenges in changing inequalities in power. So if you'd like to come and join us.
So I want to first of all start by thanking Karen. Amazing of her, after all these years, to still be not only working on gender but to invite me to this. Each decade, I've got it here. Each decade takes us further away from DPU's original work on gender policy and planning. 10 years ago, some of you may recall, the DPU associates decided they were all going to write background papers about how far we'd come, which was a very interesting thing to do. This time we have 10 minutes, so it's much easier in a way than writing a background paper. So what I want to do is I want to reflect a bit, but in that sense I want to start by saying, is it useful to look backwards in order to look forward? Years ago, before I actually even started working on gender, I did my PhD on the informal sector, 1970 Bogota market anthropology. And for me, what is so intriguing is that the informal sector disappeared. It then became the informal economy, and nowadays I get Zoom calls from erudite students at Yale who are writing PhDs about the history of the informal sector. So you see, in an ironic way, I think it's interesting to look back, because things do survive in interesting ways. I had thought informal sector had gone and had it. No, it's come back in a totally new way. So that's my reason for doing it. In the 1980s, when we worked on this, a lot of what we did, as Karen said, from moving from WID to GAD, women development to gender development, is now history. And for many of you, it may not, you may not even recall any of that work. So what I'm going to do in my 10 minutes is two things. I'm going to start by actually just recalling a bit of this with three matrices. As Karen knows, I'm a great matrix maker. And then I'm going to just have a few thoughts about the future around power issues. So if we can just, so if we go through, first of all, just you seem to have lost the top of it, but actually what it should say at the top is changing in, oh good, background reflections. Is there a change in gender policy and planning, or a change in terminology? Is what has changed, what hasn't changed? So there we are, 84 DPU, gender policy and planning, 95 gender mainstreaming. Today, 2004, I'm going to use two new strategy documents that have come out of, one by the bank and the other by the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, which we used to know as DFID, which has just come out. And in a way, I'm pausing and thinking, where does gender justice fit into relation to that? So that's the first thing to say. People change their language. That they certainly do. And what's interesting to think about is what else changes. Okay, thanks. So when we started in the 1980s, we had a very, very simple methodology. Rationale around triple roles, practical strategic gender needs and interests. And what we did was we thought through how they related to the different economic policies that were at the time out there. Welfare, residual model, women in reproductive roles and so on. Equity, which is interesting because it was the original WID approach, came out of the States, came out of women feminists working there. Anti-poverty, which was sort of toned down equity, redistribution with growth, for those of you who remember that period. Then we have efficiency, which was linked very much to structural adjustment policy, which was the macroeconomic policy at the time, making development more efficient and effective. And then we reached, in the 1980s, we reached empowerment. And I remember calling Karen, I was in Oxford, sitting there trying to, I said, Karen, I cracked it. There's a fifth approach, it's called empowerment. So it wasn't a common approach in the 1980s. Let's move on to the next slide. So then we get to the folks who did the mainstreaming in the 1990s. They were concerned with empowerment, welfare, equity, anti-poverty, efficiency, empowerment and equality. And empowerment had a very specific meaning, specific activities aimed at empowering women, as against equality, which was the integration of women and men's concerns in all policies and projects. And that was the UN, and still is, I think, the UN position on what they called mainstreaming. So let's now jump to the third one. And what I've done here is I've looked at these two new strategies that have come out, the bank this is the bank, but I use FCDO as well. So welfare has become social protection. I mean, this is just throwing out ideas. Has welfare become social protection? If you look at the language in their report, they expand access to and use of services, care, that enable economic participation. Equities disappeared totally, obviously, because it was as Western women in the 1980s. Anti-poverty really is all about inequality, build and protect human capital is the language they use. Efficiency is there, expand and enable economic opportunities, ownership and use of economic assets. Empowerment, again, is there, and equality as a human right. Advance women's participation, decision making and leadership, accelerate progress in eliminating all forms of GBV. So this is the current, just produced policy of accelerating. Now they want to accelerate gender equality. Okay, I just found it quite interesting, just as a reflection, not to have spent a lot of time on this, but to see which ones, how correct were we when we struggled in the 1980s to think which were the policy approaches, and how many of them actually the language may change and the focus may change, but are still around. So that is the first thing I just wanted to throw out to you. Okay, let's move on. So if we move on from that, I want to now really, and my top slide has gone again, challenges, something or other, hang on, let me find it. Current and future challenges, thank you. So I'm repeating, sorry Karen, I'm repeating, because I mean it's quite a statement. Antonio Guterres is saying, achieving gender equality and empowering women girls is an unfinished business of our time and the greatest human challenge in the world. So you want to ask yourself why? Because the interesting thing is the statistics on closing gender gaps are quite good in many ways, and the evidence shows impressive achievements in such fields as education, health, economics, political participation and agency. And the FCDO, for instance, now say, when women meaningfully participate in peace processes, the result agreement is 64% more likely to fail.
Less likely.
Less likely, thank you, sorry. And 35% more likely to last 15 years. So I ask myself, is this efficiency? Why are we using women in this way that somehow women? The interesting issue is that although the evidence is impressive, it hasn't changed unequal power relations with men. Patriarchy still defines binary gender identities. And the answer we want to think about is why. And I don't have all the answers, but I have a couple of thoughts. One, which has bugged me for a long time, is the emphasis on individual economic empowerment and agency, which is not on gender relations. So let's empower women individually, and then somehow we will change the nature of gender power relations. Accommodating but not changing the underlying gender norms. FCDO, gender smart British international investment in Bangladesh, gender equality provision in free trade agreements. They're busy putting gender in, but is it changing? So it's around women's individual empowerment. But the second one, which I think is, in a way, we've thought less about and is incredibly important, is that the emphasis on empowering individual women in collective organizations is more likely to hurt, but has little influence on changing collective consciousness. And that is a question, whether you agree with it or not. So we have FCDO creating and supporting multiple platforms to amplify grassroots women, etc., etc., etc. And I was thinking, because we're here, SDI, which we know so well and is so important, is that collective organizational work there to empower individual women, but from the point of view of a collective agency, or is it there to change collective consciousness? And that has become something that I think is really interesting to think about. Okay, you're doing brilliantly. Now, we've struggled with some of these things of changing, and as some of you know, we've worked more recently on gender transformation and made a distinction between gender empowerment focusing on individuals, increasing their individual bargaining power, and gender transformation as a much more of a political act that challenges power structures to see changes in structural gender power relations in social institutions. But is it really changing gender norms? And I give as an example from a few years back when I was working quite on this, a wonderful example that comes from Brazil, where there was a gender transformative municipal land regulation process in Recife, which meant that it wasn't just that they gave women individual rights, they actually put it into the structure of the institution of the planning process. So that's a structural change. But at the end of the day, is it changing gender norms, which is the interesting issue? Okay, we're nearly there. So I also did some work with DFID, as it was called then, about how do you bring in structural transformation, and being them, they had some wonderful, great consultancy company who took all the stuff that I did with them and said, okay, minimum compliance programs that address basic needs, empowerment programs that build assets and capabilities, structural transformation programs that address unequal power relations and seek legal, institutional and societal level change. So they took this on, I don't know, about 6-8 years ago. But whether it has actually changed what they do is really quite difficult to assess, and they keep changing the people that are doing this stuff. So I'm not sure about that. Okay? So I want to talk about how to change gender norms that reinforce inequalities in power. These are potential ideas. Deepan Narayan, who I used to know very well, is a very interesting person, worked a lot in India, has written a very interesting article which helped me think about this even more. First of all, saying we need greater clarification and recognition of gender norms. We need to know which are the ubiquitous, entrenched, begin at birth, allocate power to men, evoke emotions. There's a whole understanding of what gender norms. We know what they are, we know what patriarchy is, but we need to start thinking about how can we shift from individual to collective agency to change collective consciousness. The power of collective agency in changing mindsets around collective gender norms. and I'm sorry I've used the same word again, but you know, the idea that men are superior to women. I mean, it's out there all the time, whether you like it or don't like it, or whether individual men think, no, we're all equal. There are norms. Deepa, in her article, is not so strong on what to do, but does say, and we know this, and there's a great challenge of how to do it, we need to include men. The problem is not men, but it's masculinity. That defines the beliefs, the roles, and the behaviour. Men are bombarded with messages about equality while they keep living in a patriarchal world. She works in India, so a lot of this is very much influenced by her Indian view. But anyway, interventions to strengthen collective agency. Well, people are already doing a lot of this, using media, using film, using drama. But I think there's a lot more to think about on how to focus on collective agendas. And maybe some of you are doing it and can bring that to the table, because this is really, all I'm doing is throwing out some ideas. Emphasis on empowering individual and collective organisations is more likely to be heard, but has little influence on changing collective consciousness. And again, I give you a nice FCDO example of grassroots women and so on. Okay, last one, we're nearly there. So, my final reflections. This has been a wonderful opportunity, and I want to thank Karen again, because I don't often get to talk about gender these days. But things bug me, like the empowerment of women has bugged me for quite a long time, the individual empowerment issue, and I think that's now being more widely recognised. Nothing wrong at all in empowering individual women, it's essential, but it's not going to change things. The other one that's been bugging me is the way that gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, whichever one you want to call it, people call it different names, is suddenly really, really big on the agenda. And as Karen counted, I started working on urban violence in 1992, when people said it was a sort of behavioural problem of men and there was nothing on gender-based violence. And what is really interesting is the way it is now so big. And I asked myself why. Because the crudest and cruelest indicator of inequality in power is violence. So is it not... Is it actually quite strategic in a way, if you think about it, that there is so much work now going on about this? Women's safety is identified as a women's problem, not a problem of violent men. There's a lot, I read something you could restate the WHO statistics. Approximately 1/3 of men in the world commit physical or sexual violence against intimate women partners. You don't read that. You read always about the women and the number of women as victims. Men are socialised to express anger, to punish women who violate gender norms. So I ask myself, is the current focus the result of global publicity? The appalling event in India that you may remember with the woman on the bus, the appalling event of the woman in Iran, of course what's happening now in Gaza, which is absolutely appalling. Are these the reasons why? Or is it that a core indicator of shifts in power relations is a reduction in violence against women? It is an incredibly important indicator of power, and therefore does it make it, I ask myself, a priority for entry point for gender justice? And that really is the end of what I want to say. But I thought I'd end by saying, by absolute chance, an elderly male friend who comes every Friday night and has supper with us, he's a friend of my husband, was on here last Friday, and he said to me, he often goes to football, he's a football man, like a lot of men like football. But, hang on a minute, that was a bad aside, I shouldn't have said that, I'll go back. He often goes to Sunday matches, and he said to me, I'm about to go to the Emirates Stadium. It's a match between two women, the top women teams. And he commented that when there are 60,000 women and children controlling a space, it's peaceful. And it calls for little policing. The police will allow matches with two women's teams from like Arsenal versus God knows who which they can't do when they're men playing. And he said to me, he said, Caroline, the atmosphere is totally different from male matches. I said, okay, it's not rocket science, is it? There we go. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Caroline. I think there's a lot there to think about. I'd like to call on our next speaker, Claudie Bouet. Claudie is a gender expert supporting gender mainstreaming in public policies and programs in government, in international agencies, research institutions, NGOs, and very importantly, local women's organizations. And I've had the great pleasure of working with Claudie both before, during, and after her time as a member of staff at the DPU in the late 1990s. And along with our colleague Nadia Tahir, who's also here today, Claudie took the DPU's gender policy and planning methodology into Francophone countries. And it was an absolutely fascinating experience, starting with language, actually. It was very, very, very interesting. In 2003, she was a co-founding member of Genre en Action, a mainly Francophone, Africa-based gender research and advocacy network. And in 2012, she co-founded Lettres Égales to promote gender equality in France and abroad. And today, she's going to reflect on her experience of gender-responsive budgeting in a contribution entitled The Talk and the Walk of Budgeting for Gender Justice.
Thank you, Karen. Well, like Caroline did, I want to thank the DPU for the invitation, and I want to thank Karen for inviting me to join the DPU some 25 years ago. And I think those 5 years that I spent in the program definitely shaped my professional experience on gender for many years after that. I guess what I'm going to be sharing, and I hope will be echoing quite a bit of what Caroline's been saying as well, but just taking it maybe to a very practical level. My first time I run a workshop that was called Gender Responsive Budgeting was 20 years ago, and I actually did that with Adama Moussa, who was also a student at the DPU at the time, and an ex-student of the DPU. And we put together in Mali ministers, like ministers from women's ministries, gender ministries, women's rights ministries, they had different names, but also people who were in charge of finance in government. And to my knowledge, it was the first time there was actually a Francophone workshop on this very topic. Nothing existed. We had to look it all up. We had to translate everything. We had to really work from scratch. Things have changed. So what I'm going to be talking about today is gender responsive budgeting as it is now, and taking you through some, practical example and also reflections of, what I think are some of the challenges. Maybe not all of you, maybe you're not all familiar with what gender responsive budgeting is. So I'll start with a quote by American feminist Gloria Steinem, who says, "We can tell our values by looking at our checkbook stubs." So maybe the younger ones don't know what a checkbook stub is, but we can replace it with, credit card receipts, it still works. So what it says basically is that budgets reflect beliefs and values, so they're political. And budgets can talk, and they can actually be very talkative. And that's what I'm going to be trying to share with you. If you want to make a budget talk, there are two broad questions that you could be asking, and you can, have them in different variations. How can we be sure, how do we know that every penny, dollar, euro, make it any currency you want, that qualifies as public expenditure actually contributes to narrowing gender gaps and expanding gender justice? And the second big question is, are we sure that the way that the state collects revenue, so that's mainly through direct and indirect taxes, is not actually creating or enlarging gender gaps? So, like any budget, what you get and what you spend. So today, because of, the very short time that we have, I will focus on expenditures, not on revenue. There's not one single way, one single level at which gender responsive budgeting can be applied. There are just many different ways of doing it. It's a process that can happen at state level, at the local authority level, and even at institutional level. I want to share a few examples of work that I'm involved in with different teams of colleagues, just that you get a sense of what it can entail. I'll start in France, where I've been working with local authorities. And local authorities are clearly more advanced than the government in France on that matter, which is not very difficult. First example is from Bordeaux. They have a gender equality policy and they have a cultural policy at the municipal level. They want to reconcile and articulate the two better. So recently what we did is that we worked with the teams of the 3 municipal museums and we looked at their art collection and we looked at how much they, how many paintings and how many, sculptures and how many, whatever they have, by gender, female artists, male artists, non-binary artists, contemporary art, and more like 19th century, 20th century. We look at how much they pay when they purchase different pieces of art. We looked at the kind of documentation that they provide to the public, including the younger generations that come to the museum to explain different things around things that are hanging on the wall. And by doing all of that and matching figures, different numbers, different figures, creating different pies and statistics, we could actually then go to the council and actually show where the money goes and where it doesn't go and how it could be used in a different way to promote more gender equality through the way they purchase things, through the way they exhibit different artists more than others, but also through how much money they could involve in changing the way that they are portraying things in the museum. And it can be on things that we could say, well, that's a detail, but it's not a detail. And I'm coming back to your gender-based violence. You know how many paintings in the past, 19th century, 20th century painting, were described as scenes of passion. And now they are rewriting the script and saying, no, actually, this is a rape that is being painted there. It's not a scene of passion, it's a rape. So that's, part of, what we are looking at. I live in Charente, near Cognac. Maybe that rings a bell. So we work there with it was a non-topic. Gender equality was a non-topic in that decentralized institution. Yet they have many responsibilities around social protection and local development. And they spend quite a bit of money. Well, it's a small department, so it's not a very rich department. There's 35 million euros going every year as grants to different organizations and to different cities. And so they wanted to have a look at, what do they actually spend that money on? So we used gender markers, what we call gender markers, to basically create 3 categories of projects. The ones that are very unlikely to impact gender equality, like, you're renovating a church or, a historical building. Other projects that are having an impact on gender equality, yet it may not be recognized, like you are improving a health infrastructure, you're creating a cycling path, or you are, kind of renovating the city center and thinking about, different uses of the city center. And then projects, third category, projects that are directly exclusively targeting gender inequalities. So they'd be typically on gender-based violence or working with vulnerable women, which is, of course, a difficult one that we had to unpack. So we looked at the grants, we looked at who gets the grant, and well, we were not so surprised to find that the projects that are, the greatest quantity of projects are those that have not been looked at in terms of gender, and they're receiving the highest grants. The ones that are specifically targeting gender inequalities, there are very few of them, and they're not receiving much money at all. So we were able to actually come up with figures to make a point, to change the way in which the grants are being allocated. And that also meant working with the different cities and the different civil society organizations that usually apply for the grants to see, well, how can you, better think around gender issues when you apply for grants. A third example is Strasbourg. So these are quite large cities, and they've all elected green councils, ecological councils, at the last election. Now that makes quite a difference, because working on gender equality was actually part of what they had committed themselves to do once they get elected. So again, it's a political issue. And in Strasbourg, what we are doing currently is that we are reviewing their public procurement procedures. A lot of public money goes through public procurement, so revising the whole process of public procurement. And what we're also doing, we're also looking across all the different services of the municipality to see whether and how much they spend on gender-based violence. Even the service that deals with sports, do they have anything? We know there are many gender-based violence issues in sports area. So we are, looking at who does what in terms of gender-based violence, so that we can help the municipality to create a more coherent municipal policy on gender-based violence. So you may think this is quite far from the heart of what you're dealing with at the DPU. So I'll just give you a few more examples. In Saint-Louis, Senegal, we actually worked with civil organizations, and we actually analyzed with people who had nothing to do with gender and nothing to do with the municipality, just citizens. We actually trained them to analyze and understand the budget of their Saint-Louis, of their city, which is quite a large city in Senegal. So with the results, they could actually go back to the city council and say, well, look, we noticed there's no money for this, no money for that. Women traders contribute a lot, through the tax they pay for being in the market, informal sector, yet they don't get anything back in terms of improving infrastructure, etc., etc. Last year in Kenya, we analyzed the Kenya Informal Settlement Improvement Program, and again, we looked at, what is spent, how much is spent, how money is spent, so that we could actually also come up with recommendation about, how to look at the different activities of that project, whether it was land titling or renovation of roads or street lighting, etc., etc. So we actually could point areas that actually deserved to be better budgeted, so that it could have a greater impact on gender equality. And my last example, before I go into the challenges, is we're currently looking at the role of francophone parliaments, from Canada to Madagascar. We've got 80 cities, 80 countries to look at. And we're looking at how the parliament, what role is the parliament playing in checking that the policies and the budgets that go through, that the government is pushing through, how do they actually, walk the talk of gender budgeting? So all of these activities are part of gender responsive budgeting. So it's not just one thing, it's not just counting money. Gender responsive budgeting is not only counting money, but counting money is very much part of the argument. It's very much part of the kind of evidence that you can work on to try and convince people, that things could be done in a different way. I'll just walk back a few steps, because even though gender responsive budgeting has been around for quite a while, it's still quite new to many people and organizations, and yet it's already talked about in the 1975 CEDAW Convention, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. It's part of the Beijing Platform of Action 1995 that Caroline talked about, and it's, if you know Karen Levy's The Web of Institutionalization, the budget is already there, that's 1996. Today, we reckon there are about 120 countries and local authorities that are doing gender responsive budgeting around the world at different levels and in different ways. So that's clearly something to celebrate. But then we also know that SDG 5 on gender equality, I think Karen started with that, is totally underfunded. Yet it has one indicator, which is to follow the proportion of countries with systems to track and make public allocations for gender equality and women's empowerment. Which is not, they're about a quarter of all the countries that should be giving information about that indicator that are actually doing it, and the rest are not doing it. Of course, there are things to celebrate, but there are many challenges. And very often when we talk about the challenges of gender responsive budgeting, we talk about, well, same things we talk about around gender mainstreaming, the lack of political will, the lack of skills, the lack of data, some opaque budgetary practices, objectives that are, programs that are not really result-oriented, and the lack of budget to do gender-sensitive budget, which is, of course, the paradox of the whole thing. I'd like to bring a few more of these challenges into the picture, particularly in terms of who isn't there, who is actually missing in that gender-responsive budgeting picture. I mean, public policies like budgets are political, yet, I mean, it's not just what I see, what I hear, what I read, also, discussing it with, other people. Gender-responsive budgeting has become a rather technical and institutional affair. So a lot of efforts are being spent on, kind of fixing the budgetary processes and adding criteria and creating, new Excel tables where you can just, tag things, in a different way. But actually very little is spent on measuring if those efforts are producing something in terms of closing gender gaps on the ground. So citizens are missing, and particularly women are missing in this picture. So the key challenge is to ensure that gender-responsive budgeting actually results in truly transformative policies. But too often, I think it is at the moment used to fix gender-blind policies and to make sure that they create a bit less damage on women and men. And I mean, clearly, when we work on gender justice, I think the do no harm is not enough. The walk is too short. Another thing which for me is a big challenge is the fact that it's mostly ministries of economy and finance that are clearly now leading gender-responsive budgeting. And that's also mainly because donors put it all on the table of the Ministry of Economy and Finance. And that has, for me, that creates, again, new challenges. First of all, it puts an emphasis on getting financial and budgetary processes right, rather than getting policies right, particularly in terms of human rights and gender justice. And in implementation, and I'm not saying that I'm worried that I may be getting out of a job recently, but what we can really observe is the shift from employing people like me who are gender experts with some public finance expertise to actually employing experts in public finances with some, and sometimes some very little gender expertise. So that's also, for me, that's quite an indicator. Absent national machineries for gender are absent. By that I mean Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Gender, Women's Rights. They're totally marginalized. They're just not part of the picture anymore. I mean, we knew they were quite weak, but this is actually emphasizing it. Feminist organizations are also not part of the picture. Yet we know that in those countries where they can get involved in gender-responsive budgeting, they actually manage to go much beyond just fixing policies, but actually creating more transformative policies. And for me, that's quite complicated, because what we are also seeing is donors that are supporting gender-responsive initiatives in countries that have a very poor track record in democratic behaviors. So if you take CSOs and particularly feminist organizations out of the picture, I think you are just re-emphasizing this. And parliaments, I mean, I mentioned earlier on, we work on parliaments. They're not into the picture. Donors very much behave as if budgets are just a government issue, not a parliament issue. And so, of course, that's another governance issue. And I guess that maybe for us the biggest challenge is to actually start electing more people that really have a determination to fight patriarchal biases in policies and budgets. I'd like to close that, because Karen is waving, but I'm late. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. It's wonderful to get the benefits of that amazing experience, and I'm sure there's also going to be lots of questions related to that. The next speaker is going to be a recording by Redora Bukoy. Redora is a gender and development, a GAD and rights activist at local, national, regional and international levels. She is a former professor of political science and gender studies at the University of the Philippines in Cebu. And between 2013 and 2016, she served as a commissioner on the Philippine Commission on Women representing the academic sector. And then in 2016, she was elected the chairperson of the Philippine Commission on Women, which she served there for 4 years. Because of the time difference, Rudora will make her presentation through a recorded conversation with my colleague Jordana Ramalho. So thank you so much for doing that. So let's move on to that presentation. Thank you.
Rhodora, welcome, and yeah, we're absolutely delighted to have you be part of this panel celebrating DPU's 70th anniversary, and specifically, I think it's 40 years of the Gender in Policy and Planning program. So thank you very much for your time. We have 3 questions for you as part of this panel. The first question really is to ask you to reflect on your experience in the Philippines, or more generally, around gender mainstreaming. And I guess, what do you consider to be the main successes connected with gender mainstreaming in the Philippines?
Firstly, I would like to thank you for inviting me to join in this conversation on gender mainstreaming and share my thoughts about what we are doing in the Philippines. With regards to gender mainstreaming in the Philippines, this has been the strategy that the Philippines has adopted in line with the call of the UN Platform of Action in 1995. And as a strategy, this has led to the establishment of a national machinery we now call the Philippine Commission on Women. And this national machinery is responsible for the overall policy making on gender and development, as well as an oversight body to ensure that all government agencies pursue gender equality and women empowerment as part of their agenda. And gender mainstreaming today implies that we have what we call enabling mechanisms in place to provide technical assistance as well as guidance to different line agencies in their GAD planning, budgeting, monitoring, and implementation. And I think that's where the Philippines has made significant strides in terms of establishing these enabling mechanisms. And these enabling mechanisms come in the form of what we call gender and development focal point system, who are trained to do GAD work, to understand the elements of GAD mainstreaming, to understand about gender issues. So these are the lead persons in the mainstreaming efforts, from the national down to the regional and to the local government units we call barangays in the Philippines. Aside from this establishment of a national machinery, we have, of course, passed significant legislations. I think it's a major achievement of the Philippine government with the support or the lobby of the women's groups or the women's movement. And so we have significant landmark policies passed already. And in relation to the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, we now have the Magna Carta of Women, which enshrines the rights of women, especially the marginalized sectors. Another very important achievement of our GAD mainstreaming effort is, aside from pushing for our what we call the Women's Priority Legislative Agenda, where we want to amend laws that contain discriminatory provisions, which still have masculinist biases. We also have put in place laws that expanded the concept of rape, that rape is no longer a crime against chastity, but it's a crime against persons. And there are laws that provide assistance to rape victims and survivors. And we have a lot of landmark decisions ending sexual harassment in the workplace, in the education sector, in the training environment. And this is now broadened with the latest law we call Safe Spaces Act, which include violence against women online and offline, in public and the private spheres. So I think in terms of legal achievements, our GAD mainstreaming effort has done considerably significant inputs or achievements.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. And I think that goes a long way in sort of explaining why for so long the Philippines was ranked so highly in a number of different gender equality indicators. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask a question relating to kind of ongoing constraints. So what do you see as the main kind of constraints or stumbling blocks that continue to be encountered in gender mainstreaming work? And perhaps connected with that, what if anything, do you think could help to enhance the ability of the Philippines Commission of Women to advance gender equality or to kind of facilitate gender mainstreaming?
There's a lack of competence in many agencies. So we have to continuously capacitate GAD focal persons and to develop GAD experts will really ensure that our programs, projects, and activities will not only answer the practical gender needs, what we call practical gender needs, but also the more strategic gender needs of ensuring that women will not only enjoy welfare projects, but also be conscientized and be able to have meaningful and full participation in governance and decision-making processes. And women will have control over their lives. And also one of the other constraint is the lack of finances. So we have less authority and we need to have a bigger budget in order to localize the Magna Carta women, meaning bring that to the grassroots and really address the vulnerable sectors defined in the Magna Carta of women, indigenous women, the Muslim women, urban poor women, peasant women, solo parents, workers, migrant workers, fisher folk. We really have to push a lot of the poverty, anti-poverty agenda and to address the feminization of poverty. And this needs much resources. So that's another constraint. And also the other one is the ability to sustain our technical assistance and to have a sustainable pool of gender and development experts down to the ground level, and then promote leadership from among the women, the grassroots women, so they would play a very active role in the process, in the development process. So I think, as far as I am concerned, I think the Commission and the GAD advocates in government has to sharpen its grasp of what we call the intersectionality perspective or paradigm, so that they become conscious really of the need to weave through in all its actions the ultimate goal of empowering the marginalized sectors and empowering those who are left behind in the development process in our country.
Thanks so much, Rhoda. As a final question, I just wanted to get a sense from you as to whether or not you think the concept or notion of gender mainstreaming is still a useful concept to guide us in this work, given kind of challenges that we're likely to face, at present and into the future. And following on from that, if we do decide to keep the notion of gender mainstreaming, under what conditions do you think can kind of facilitate its success?
GAD mainstreaming in a way is a very useful strategy because it reminds all GAD practitioners in my country to really ensure that the overall development agenda would address the vision, the goals, the interests and needs of women. And of course, the other very important useful aspect of this strategy is that we have to ensure that there is a gender analysis in all our plans, programs, projects, and activities to ensure that it will not exacerbate the existing unequal relations between men and women. So in a way, the GAD mainstreaming framework alerts us to the need of women empowerment, at the same time the need to engage men in the process of pushing for the overall agenda of gender equality. And in the more recent times, there is a call to incorporate what we call the need to address not only the interests of women, but also the need to address what we call the interests of those that belong to people of different sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics, or the SOG++ issue is also popular and being integrated into the Dagad mainstreaming work that we are doing. So essentially, it is still very useful, but I would like to believe that doing change or transforming Philippine society into one that is just, equitable, democratic, and inclusive needs not only organizational change, but it also involved to me transformation of the social structures or the barriers that prevent us from really empowering women, empowering people. And that would necessitate, for instance, structures not only changing the structures not only locally, but nationally, but also globally. And I think this is the global political economy question is probably missing in the discourse and the discussions of a lot of our God practitioners, except for a few feminists in government that are really engaged in not just liberal feminism, but more progressive socialist feminist discourse. And so for me, that is one area that the women's movement or those working, the God champions within governments to look into. That, of course, they're aware that transforming the mainstream into one that is from one that is elitist as it is now to one that is more democratic is difficult. And it does not only entail changes of the laws, it entails also changing mindsets of people, changing the norms and the values of people. And that's where it's very difficult to do. But I think through the educational system and through our consciousness raising activities in all the God sensitivity trainings that we do, we are alerting people to the need really to look at this in a macro way, and that there are global policies like policies of globalization and other unfair trade practices that could impinge on the development of our country. And in the current review that we are doing as we prepare for the UN conference on the status of women 68 this coming March, we look into the need for what we call South-South dialogue, not just North-South dialogue, and the need to look at the depth of many developing countries like the Philippines, where we have trillions of dollars of debt, and which exhausts a lot of our resources, which could have been channeled to anti-poverty and social protection. And so that is, I think, one area that we have to consider in rethinking our God mainstreaming approach. And that we are not only looking at organizational changes, but really a broader societal transformation. And that would need empowerment of peoples, men, women, and the vulnerable sectors of our society.
That's great. Rodra, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your insights with us. We really appreciate it.
Deeply appreciate your engaging us in this discussion in connection with your anniversary. More power to men and women of your department.
Thanks, Rodra.
Thank you so much for doing that, Susan. It was very nice to have that input. And I'm just sorry that she can't be with us to respond to questions, but I'm sure we'll find a way of discussing some of the issues that she raised. I'd like to move on to the next speaker, Leslie Crossdale. It's a great pleasure and joy for me to introduce Leslie, who is a DPU alumni. Her experiences in the field of humanitarian affairs and city diplomacy, and currently she's the co-executive director of City Hub and Network for Gender Equality, or the acronym CHANGE. appropriately, and which works with a network of cities of high, middle and low income countries, with the aim to empower women in all their diversity and seeking to harness the collective power of cities to transform government to the benefit of all. So her contribution will be looking at gender mainstreaming in the city, and she'll be reflecting on how the caring city has become a promising framework to create more inclusive communities.
Hi everyone. First of all, just thank you to Karen and thank you to Jordana for inviting me. It's super exciting to be here. So as Karen said, I'm Leslie Crosdale. I lead a network of cities that focus on advancing gender equity. And today I'm going to give you a few examples of how some of my cities are advancing gender mainstreaming and sharing some of my thoughts on how gender mainstreaming might move forward in the future for cities. So I won't spend too much time on this, but I do want to tell you a little bit about my network. So here you can see a map of our membership. It's 12 cities, and we're coming together to exchange knowledge and iterate on good practice on how to tackle gender-based violence, how to use gender data for municipal policymaking, and how to improve care infrastructure. We ask our cities to think about these 4 rules as avenues to impact their constituents. So they're often innovators, right? They're piloting and scaling good ideas. They're usually the anchor institution in their communities, and they set the tone for good employment and procurement practices, which we talked about before. They're convening actors within the city and beyond, heads change, to think about how to advance gender equity, and their service providers. And so as a network, we're thinking about how to apply a gender lens to all these roles. When I was invited to speak today, the question I was asked to answer was, what are some of the successes and constraints in gender mainstreaming in the work that I see through our network? And I just wanted to offer a top-line view before going into sort of 2 case studies. I wouldn't be here today if I didn't think gender mainstreaming had value. And so I think what it does really well is it makes visible what was previously invisible. And that by sort of putting a spotlight on the needs of women and girls and people with non-binary gender identities, it allows policymakers to write strategies around those gaps and then funnel funding into it. And I'll show some examples of that coming up. And it also creates space for socializing and norm shifting that is essential if you want to tackle gender inequity. The big challenge, I think, is its reliance on political will. So the examples I'm about to give are examples that are made possible by mayors who are fiercely and unapologetically feminist. And the issue with that is if they step down or they're voted out and they're replaced by someone who's not as strong a feminist, that movement loses momentum. In some cases, if the new political party comes in is anti-feminist, then the gender mainstreaming policy has a target on its back and is actively dismantled, which we're seeing increasingly as a sort of anti-rights and anti-feminist movement picks up momentum. So I'm going to talk to you about one case study in our network, which is from Colombia, Bogota's care system. So I'm sure many people in this room already know about this case study, but essentially, former Mayor Claudia Lopez understood that 1.9 million women in her city were using almost all of, if not all of their time to care for the people around them, the elderly, the disabled, their children. And what they weren't doing was spending time on their own health and well-being. So what she did to address this time poverty was she spatially reorganized her neighborhoods into what we see here as care blocks to bring essential services into a 20-minute radius to essentially win back some time that caregivers can invest in themselves. The care blocks offer 3 things. The opportunity to care for those who care for us, so that's caring for caregivers, and That means allowing them to go back to school and get a diploma. It means upskilling. It means going to health services or well-being facilities. But that's also made possible by reabsorbing some of the responsibility for care for their dependents. So that means, childcare, after-school activities. It means psychosocial and physical support for those with disabilities. And the final piece that's really important to the care blocks is the care school for men. So if you talk to any of the women who worked in Claudia Lopez's government, they'll say women weren't born with the knowledge of how to cook and clean and care for children. We had to learn it, and so can men. And so that's an essential part of this project. It has 3 objectives: to recognize the work of caregivers, to redistribute the burden of unpaid care, and to reduce the burden of unpaid care. So here, very quickly, are the care blocks in images. You'll see here the care school for men, where they actually are learning how to cut carrots. Wellness and well-being activities here. Graduation from education services, childcare. We don't have time to talk about it, but the city also thought about different modalities of delivering care through the care bus for more remote parts of the city. And here you can see the anchor building of the care block in Ciudad de Bolivar, which is an informal settlement in Bogota. And the reason I put that here is that it kind of shows how much the care blocks are enmeshed in the neighborhoods, right? It's built on a cable car station right in the heart of the city. It's meant to be easily accessible. It's meant to be part of the urban fabric that already is being used. I just wanted to touch on 3 things that I think make this a successful project. One is how much the mayor and the municipality collaborated with the feminist movement to make this happen. Mayor Claudia Lopez campaigned on this promise, and she made this promise to the feminist movement, who really held her feet to the fire throughout her time in office. The other thing she did that was really successful was she did first and asked questions later. She really started this project basically at the beginning of the pandemic and felt that she didn't have the time or the resources to do big feasibility studies, to trial stuff out. She really just did it, did a really reflexive practice, did it, reiterated on it, grew and grew and grew. And it's really near the end of her term that she started enshrining it in law in the master plan, so that by the time she'd reached millions of women and that everyone had seen the care block in action, she had political buy-in from the whole political spectrum, so that by the time the next election came around, from the right to the left, everyone had promised to protect the care blocks. And it has the sort of double protection of being in law in the master plan. The final thing I wanted to touch on was just this question of co-responsibility of care, which is a major normative shift that she brought in. So what she's proposing and what her team are proposing was a sort of renegotiation of the social contract, of saying that care is something that benefits us all. It's the backbone of a healthy society, and it's all of our responsibilities to contribute. So it can't only be household, it has to be government, it has to be private sector, it has to be civil society. And she's really put that forward as an idea that with time people have bought into. And I won't have too much time to talk about it here, but that's a hard pitch. I mean, it's a hard pitch in a place like Colombia, where for a long time the state wasn't present when caregivers needed them, and you have to sort of reintroduce the state and get that buy-in again. But in a lot of places, people don't feel that the state has a responsibility in their home, that this is a negotiation between sort of you and your partner, or you and your parents. And it's a hard thing to sell, but when done correctly, it works well. So I'll sort of put that out there and wrap up with my final thoughts on where does that leave us with gender mainstreaming. So, I mean, very clearly, I think there is a place and a lot of value in gender mainstreaming. the work that I see the cities in our network doing really pushes me to wonder if care and the caring city is a sort of spin that that will take gender mainstreaming into the next decade, 2 decades. There are sort of 3 reasons I think care is an interesting paradigm to think about. One is simply that there's a lot of momentum around care, and that's because of the pandemic. The pandemic made really clear that caregivers are the backbone of our society and that it's infrastructure that we need to invest in. And there's just a lot of momentum around it, and sometimes you just have to know when to ride a wave. The other thing is that what you've seen in the 2 projects here is that care is, the caring city is a platform to spin off of. So it's not that we should only think about sort of access to daycare, even though that's important, but it allows us to spin out and talk about sort of how we're doing our spatial planning, how we're approaching gender-based violence, how we're thinking about transportation, so on and so forth. So it's a really good jumping off point to think of like a whole of society approach. And the final piece, and this is something that really the team in Bogota were really strong about. Care is really something that isn't divisive. Like from the political left to the political right, for whatever reason, everybody agrees that care is important and that they want to invest in it. It's something that calls men in, as you can see with Care School for Men. It's something that we can sort of all get around. And so that sort of allows for quicker wins and more momentum and more progress. And I think that makes it a really great entry point. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I think that really added another dimension to our discussion today. I'd like to call on our final speaker, my colleague Gillian Walker, who's Professor of Inclusive Social Policy here at the Barclays at DPU, and who co-directs the DPU Gender Policy and Program with me. His work engages with social and development policy and explores the relationship between diverse social identities and experiences of development, with a particular focus on gender, disability, age, and other intersections. And he's developed methodological approaches for working with social identity in his research and in practice interventions of practitioners, addressing concerns in relation to urban governance, livelihoods and citizenship of the urban poor, and addressing issues of equity. And today he's going to take us to the multilateral level and to talk about gender mainstreaming in multilateral development organizations, posing the question, is there some space for optimism? Julian's long legs part of our conversation immediately.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Karen. So I'm last, so I think you're all probably quite exhausted by now, so I'll try and not be too heavy. So the entry point, I thought, was some space for optimism, because normally in these discussions around gender mainstreaming, everyone's completely depressed by the end of it, of all the challenges and stuff. But actually, we've had, I feel like, lots of optimism already today. However, I still think it's worth discussing when we're talking about multilateral organisations, because I feel that's where a lot of the critiques of gender mainstreaming really hit hardest. The ideas of these big development institutions being the real hub of the problem of mainstreaming not quite working. Now, I might have to do the buttons because I'm a control freak, so I put too many animations and you're going to go crazy otherwise. So, thinking about critiques of gender mainstreaming multilateral development agencies, I feel like this is where a lot of the sort of critique has been, and actually we've had lots of interesting points about the different ways of trying to work with gender mainstreaming. And actually looking at Rao and Kelleher, looking at how mainstream works in organisations, they make the distinction between gender infrastructure, organisational change and institutional change. So gender infrastructure is a lot of the things that Radura was talking about, like having a gender focal point or a gender policy. But the point that they make is that often happens just at the symbolic level, and while that's important, if there's nothing else there, it doesn't work. So organisational change is the much bigger thing about actually how you change the constitution and working of the organisation. But even that can be what I think Caroline was talking about, where you incorporate gender or women into the existing structure of the organisation. as opposed to institutional change, which I think when we're talking about gender justice and transformation, about fundamentally reconstituting the way these organisations work. And that's what a lot of Karen's contribution with the Web of Institutionalisation is looking at these organisations and the sites of power that need to be fundamentally reconstituted if we're going to work towards gender justice. I think the second big area of critique that we often see in relation to multilateral development agencies is around the idea of work on gender and gender equality as being very top-down or instrumental and almost a neo-colonial project. So actually, Caroline, when she was talking about the policy paradigms, talked about, for example, with efficiency, and I give that an example of the appropriation of work on women and then subsequently on gender, but to instrumental ends. So actually, how can gender relations or how can women promote economic development? And Sylvia Chan and Sweetman were looking at that under the framing of smart economics. So in a way, how this work on gender and gender equality can be exploited to quite different ends, moving us away from gender justice. So just as a little bit of an example of that, we did at the DPU a lot of work on capacity building in multilateral organisations. So I did a lot of work with Nadia, with Claudia, with Karen, doing this kind of capacity building. And actually, this problem of the gender infrastructure, but not going beyond that, was something we kept bumping up against. So actually, the gender equality marker, which actually Claudia was talking about, which you can use, as you can see, in much more progressive ways, often became a very problematic thing. So the gender equality marker has become a mandatory tool for UN entities since 2012 to track expenditures according to their contribution to gender equality and women's rights. The way that works, as Claudia explained, is it's broken down into gender equality as a principal objective, a significant objective, contributes to it, or it's not really related. And my experience of working on this, actually, I remember I was working in a UN agency, which I won't mention the name of, and I was told quite early, oh yeah, the way we deal with this is we just tick the last box, and then it means the whole problem goes away. We don't have to talk about it anymore. So you literally saw this kind of, the symbolism is there, they have the system, but really you need a lot more to get that moving. So, having said that, I wanted to talk about what I thought was an instance of multilateral work on gender equality, which I really felt has been successful in keeping an eye on the sort of transformative gender justice approach, which I found very encouraging. And this is based on, I did a couple of evaluations with the ILO, one which was much more a classic gender mainstreaming country programs, and one which was on a new convention they had around the rights of domestic workers. So I'd like to talk about that one, because I really felt there was a lot to learn about how gender mainstreaming can get some kind of traction in these organisations. So, domestic work, we're talking about domestic work in terms of employment, is a sector of employment which is frequently, so often domestic workers, so people doing paid work in household and so on, normally without contracts, ununionised, not subject to labour inspection, not party to the normal ILO tripartite relations where you'll get the state, you'll get employers and workers' organisations negotiating together, because it doesn't really exist in those forms. So who are the employers of domestic workers? They don't work collectively, they're private households. Labour inspectors feel they can't go into private households. And as a result of those things, domestic workers often have fundamental labour abuses. So the lack of the right to rest, hours of work, sick pay, missing out on social security, employment benefits, paid partly or fully in kind, so that means that actually because you're living somewhere and getting food, you're way below the minimum wage, or you may not even be paid at all, subject to unpoliced violence and abuse. And these have especially severe impacts for groups such as, for example, child or migrant domestic workers. So we could go into it, but basically it's a nightmare for employment and employment rights. So the ILO, in response, adopted a convention at the ILO Labour Convention in 2011, Convention 189, which is trying to deal with all these things and actually think, how can we extend these fundamental rights to domestic workers? It's been ratified in not so many countries, the green ones, people have ratified, countries that ratified the convention, but the yellow ones are countries that haven't ratified the convention but have adopted parallel laws. So actually it's really become a sort of point for them to move forward. Shamefully, you can say the UK is not one of the countries that's done anything. So thinking about the work they've done with the convention, from my experience of the evaluation, is the ILO's work on Convention 189 gender mainstream? So actually, if we're talking about domestic workers, there's no mention of gender there, but how does this relate to gender mainstreaming? So domestic workers' rights, for a start, when you talk to people and say, what's the gender relation here, often the framing, as Caroline was talking about WID and GAD, people see it very much in WID terms. So it's a women's sector. It's a highly unprotected sector, but it's predominantly female. Globally, 83% of domestic workers are women. So in a way, just working on this means you're working on a huge area of employment for women. So that's important. And actually, if you look at the proportions regionally, it's quite interesting. You can see that, although interesting, for example, in the Arab states, you can see the majority of domestic workers are men. So it's a bit more complicated than being a women's sector. But actually, I would say it's not a WID thing. It's a gender thing for a number of reasons. So firstly, if you look at the idea of feminisation of employment, so we've seen all over the world a massive growth in women's employment, and that was often seen with export, trade-led economic growth. So Standing talked about that a lot, if you're interested. So the feminisation of work, labour, however, is not just about more women coming into the world of work, it's also about increased women employment, but also more feminised terms of employment. So actually, we're getting more women working, but as a result, we're seeing people working in more unskilled, low-paid, part-time, flexible, without protection. And actually, that is lowering the bar for women and men. It's exploiting gender relations that women are more willing to work on these terms to actually change labour relations for everyone. And I would say domestic work is a hyper example of this feminised employment, and that affects both women and men.
Recording in progress.
I think the second thing, and it relates to a lot of what Leslie was talking about, is the abuses around domestic work is very much linked to the devaluing of care work, so the idea that care work is secondary. And often in domestic work, production, i.e. paid work, is conflated with reproduction. So often domestic workers aren't really seen as workers, and actually the slogan that the ILO use is domestic workers real work. So for example, in Zambia, which is one of the countries in the evaluation, 66% of domestic workers are unpaid and viewed not as employees, but as dependents or distant relatives, despite the fact that they have clear employment relations, assigned tasks, sanctions for performance, etc. So basically, it's a form of employment that's not even really treated as employment. Often people aren't even paid. And actually in Zambia, 44% of those domestic workers are male. So it's a sort of gendered relation around care that leads to this sort of very problematic treatment of work. Also, I think domestic work is very much linked, even though it's about paid work, it's very much linked to gender relations around reproduction, about the unpaid care work that Leslie was talking about. So what we see is the reason we see so much domestic work is rather than sharing reproductive work with male partners, many better off heterosexual working women pay other women to take this off, creating gender care trade. So actually displacing this work down to more and more economically vulnerable women, rather than reconstituting work, valuing work, and saying actually like the men's, exactly the opposite of that. So there are sort of different arguments about should we be getting rid of domestic work, or should we say domestic work is here to stay and we treat it properly, we value it. I think another area that domestic work is very gendered is the public-private dichotomy is massive here. So actually one of the big problems is the understanding of the household as a private domestic space where, for example, labour inspectors can't go. They don't have the right to go and inspect what are you doing in your private household. Is that in lots of countries they're not able to do it. And that means also that employers of domestic workers are not seen as employers. So the whole labour negotiation systems break down because of this. Okay. I think it's also, and I think linked to that, you can see domestic work as very gendered because it happens in the private sphere. It's very much linked to gendered power relations. So domestic work often is in this unregulated site, which makes domestic workers incredibly vulnerable to violence and sexual abuse. And I think the other thing is, if we look at gender in intersectional terms, domestic work is a massive site of intersectional gender relations. So actually, what we often see with domestic work is the intersection of gender with class, economic class, and also race in many contexts. And actually, that creates particular problems with collective action around this and sort of gender action, where often you find that women and unionists, so women's rights activists or unionists, may feel separate from that because it's a sort of different category. So it can create problems of sort of solidarity around gender and the movement around these kind of employment rights. So I was trying to say, so it is to do with gender, even though it doesn't have gender in the title. Why did I think that this was a sort of very successful or promising example of gender mainstreaming? I'd say straight away what was really interesting for me with this evaluation and this this work that the ILO is doing is the ILO specialist staff, so the people working on wages or collective bargaining, they all saw the work on the convention as very clearly central to their main job. And actually, this is very different. So I said the other evaluation that we did, and actually Nadia was working on with me, was looking at gender mainstreaming in country programs. And the problem there is, you work on it, people say, yes, gender is really important, we can see the issue, but I don't see how it relates to my job. So I'm committed, but I can't do it. Whereas here, you could really see all the people involved were like, yes, this is at the heart of what I'm trying to do as a collective bargaining specialist, as a wage expert, and they could really see, this is my job, and if I'm not doing this, I'm not doing my job. And just to say, that's not trashing the gender mainstream work, because I think in a way, the fact that they were able to do that, the precondition for that was all the gender mainstream work the ILO had done to sort of get people aware of it, and then suddenly this is where it landed, and they saw, this is what I can do. Secondly, I think the work on the convention is focused on labour rights rather than instrumental approaches. So what's really nice about the ILO is they're working on rights, and a lot of the other multilateral institutions are working on environmental protection, economic development. So it's easy to go into these instrumental approaches, and this rights is really very much at the centre of what they're doing. Thirdly, the work on the convention was very much embedded in local labour movements and their priorities, in contrast to this sort of critique of the neoliberal and top-down approach for a lot of gender stuff. So it really was embedded in grassroots social and labour movements, which I felt was a sort of very strong aspect of how they were approaching gender mainstreaming there. And finally, for me, I think we've been talking a lot about gender mainstreaming as the transformation of social norms and actually changing the way we do things rather than bringing gender into the status quo. So for me, actually, I thought it was really interesting that the convention could be super transformative as a model for addressing labour rights in a structurally informal sector. So rather than say, what can we learn for the work of normal work and bring it to domestic work, actually, given, for example, the growing feminisation of all work, the gig economy, all these different things, what we're seeing is the mainstream of work is becoming much more like domestic workers. So what can we learn from that to how we work on the mainstream of work? And just to give a couple of examples, and then I'll shut up. So this is from Zambia, one of the countries, and actually what they've done here is they've got leaflets with basically, this is a leaflet with all your rights as a domestic worker in the convention. They know that they don't have the labour inspection capacity to go and police this. So what they're doing is in training centres for domestic workers or in local communities, they're putting this out there so everybody knows. So even if the labour inspector's not going to come and tell you off, your neighbours know that you're supposed to have the weekend off or this minimum wage. So it's more about the sort of social governance of labour rights. And actually, I think, given the feminisation of work, that could be super important. And finally, Caroline was talking about ways of changing norms, and actually one of the things they were doing there specifically was doing this public drama about domestic workers, about rights, to try and reconstitute public education and awareness of some of these issues. So that was it. I just wanted to sort of give an example to try and think about how these international organisations could work on gender mainstreaming in a way which is, I think, a bit truer to this concept of gender justice and be a bit optimistic about that. Okay.
Thank you so much. I know that we've reached the end of our time, and I feel quite honestly that I could do with another hour and a half of discussion with these amazingly rich variety of contributions. I don't want to stop this without asking whether anybody has a really, urgent question that's in their mind that they'd like to just put out there before we wrap up, which I will have to do pretty shortly. If not, I know that everything we've said here we can take forward in other ways to have the chance to talk in more detail about these. I think what is so extraordinary is the range of experience that we've heard tonight. Quite remarkable. Anybody want to say anything? No?
We destroyed.
Yes, I mean, well, I think to pull this together, I think that there is a work on social justice and equality that many of us have been involved in the DPU that is curiously it is talking to the whole feminist experience of gender equality, but perhaps not enough. And at the same time, the feminist work on gender justice isn't talking directly to that experience that we work with around equality and socio-economic and environmental justice in all our work. And it struck me as I was listening that based on the work of Iris Marion Young and Nancy Fraser and the work that we've done in the No program and in other research programs, the four areas or dimensions, the intersecting dimensions of justice, seem to me a wonderful way of pulling together a lot of what people have talked about. So the first dimension is around equal distribution, and I would frame that as an equal opportunity to access the material dimension that constitute dignified quality of life, including access to income, to decent work, housing, health, basic services, all the things you talked about in the care blocks that you spoke about. And obviously at the center of all of this is also a secure life free from violence for women, men, and people of other gender identities. And so it seems to me that there is something there, and because it's a gender, we're talking about gender, we're talking about these things across both the public and the private sector, which perhaps discussions on gender justice don't always get to. And not gender justice, social justice don't always get to. I think the discussions on gender justice always get to that public-private continuum. I think there's the other dimension, which is the dimension of what I've called in my work reciprocal recognition. And I think that this has come to the fore in the way Caroline talks about collective consciousness for me. For me, reciprocal recognition is about the conscious and critical recognition of equal rights in institutional and organizational practices in the state, in the private sector, and in civil society, and in the family, and by all the men and women who engage in those institutions. And so I call it reciprocal because it's not just about what those institutions do, but it's also what people, women and men, claim for themselves and what they see as their collective rights in this process. So I think that's really a very important part of what we're talking about. The parity political participation is something that Nancy Fraser has talked about for a long time, and I think that this is obviously focused on the question of citizenship, and I think gender has always been very strong and had very powerful arguments in that respect. And I think what's come through tonight so strongly in all the debates and discussions is what for me is the fourth dimension of social justice and equality, which is the solidarity and mutual care that's come through in all kinds of ways, and again straddles public and private, this public-private continuum. And so I think that there is something, I think, extremely valuable in actually talking about gender justice, knowing all that we know and all that we've learned from the experience of mainstreaming as a kind of way of rejuvenating our work, which I think continues. The struggle continues, as we know. And I just think that I'd like to really thank the speakers so much, because I just feel there's been such a richness of experience shared tonight, and I'm extremely valuable. And now I'm going to go and watch the webinar, which all of you can do as well, and rethink a lot of things. And I have hundreds of questions, and so maybe we'll find a forum where we can share that. So thank you so much for coming.